Once upon a time, when politicians wanted to shoot the messenger, they would lash out at newspaper headlines. Now, they rue against algorithms. On Tuesday, the U.S. president accusing Google, Facebook, and Twitter of bias, Trump singling out Google in particular over search engine results that he claims unfairly point to unflattering stories. Is it just sour grapes? What's in an algorithm these days? And are computers shaping public opinion? The Trump administration's calling for regulation. What would that entail? Ahead of next week's hearings on Capitol Hill on Russia meddling in U.S. elections, we're talking the same week that Facebook announced it was taking down 20 accounts tied to high-ups in Myanmar's regime. The announcement made on Monday, the same day a UN panel officially accused the leadership there of genocide. How much does social media stoke hate? Up till recently, social media giants refused to acknowledge they were publishers, subject to the same libel laws as any other media. Instead, while painting themselves as facilitators, as the European Union ponders new ways to crack down on the spread of extremist propaganda, how much have Silicon Valley-based social media giants evolved the past couple of years? And what is the right balance between free speech and censorship? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at algorithm anxieties, and joining us here in the studio, Aislinn Connolly, researcher at Paris's École Normale Supérieure. Your specialty, cryptography.
And privacy.
And privacy. Cryptography, well, that's Nadim Kobesi's beat. Thank you for being with us. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From the United States, we welcome a former editor-in-chief of the London offices of alt-right website Breitbart News. Rahim Kassam is with the conservative Claremont Institute think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from New York, Gregory Smith-Simon, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. His latest book, Cause and How It Doesn't Always Equal Effect. Nice to see you, Greg.
Good to be with you, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. First he tweeted, Google and others are suppressing voices of conservatives and hiding information and news that is good. Then Donald Trump spoke.
I think Google is really taking advantage of a lot of people, and I think that's a very serious thing, and it's a very serious charge. I think what Google and what others are doing, if you look at what's going on at Twitter, if you look at what's going on in Facebook, they better be careful, because you can't do that to people. You can't do it.
So Aislinn Connolly, does he have a point?
Well, he has some valid points, but in one sense, the first thing that he says is that, they're not showing anything good. Should all news or should all results that Google find be good news? No, I mean, like all of us in this room here, I think will agree that there are at least 2 or 3 or 4 or, millions of points to make on every story. They can't all be good, and we cannot all be in agreement. And so this is, I think...
He says there's an imbalance between good and bad news about his presidency.
Yeah, the thing that Google does is try to bring, the most, what they call useful information to the top of the stream. So by doing this, they bring, whatever will catch the most clicks and whatever they feel people will be most interested in. And what catches most clicks are, things that get attention, like quick stories, drastic news, and so these naturally kind of rise to the top of the Google search results from their algorithms, not based on like political bias, but based on just what will get more clicks.
So the story that will trigger the most emotions wins out in these algorithms over the story that's the most relevant. Is that, do you agree with that premise?
I completely agree, and my opinion falls in line with what Ainsley has expressed. Aislinn, sorry. What I would contribute to this is that it doesn't matter whether what Trump said is correct. Actually, it's been suggested that he's quoting a study that was released recently that goes in that direction, that says that the news on Google is indeed favoring liberal media outlets. But it doesn't matter. I don't personally think what he's saying is necessarily true. There was a really good article on Wired recently that went and did a full analysis of the whole situation, and no one knows how these algorithms work. And people project their own political insecurities, their own uncertainties on what they want to see. And the reality might be as simple as just a bunch of sensationalist or emotional articles getting the most clicks, getting the most attention, which is exactly how journalism has received most of its attention over the past many decades. So,
or centuries even.
Or yeah, since a long time ago. So more productively, what I would like to say is, it doesn't matter whether what Mr. Trump said is true or not. What matters is, do we have a way to verify the methodology, the procedures, the algorithms with which something like Google looks at a whole internet and then retrieves these results? Can we independently look at that?
So what you're suggesting here is that algorithms are a matter of public interest, and therefore Google says we can't give you the secret sauce to our algorithm because that would be giving away trade secrets and it would give a leg up on the competition. You're saying that should be out in the public?
That's a valid concern for Google to have, but I'd like to point out that when Google first started out, it started out in a garage. It was a project meant to just index a public wealth of information that was on the internet when it was still starting out. Nobody at Google and nobody in the whole world back then, or even as early or as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, really knew that the internet would have the importance that it has today on the political sphere. So what I would like to say today is not an argument for the nationalization of these algorithms, for sort of a political clampdown or a governmental clampdown on how these systems work, but rather simply make an appeal to researchers, to people who want to help us obtain a more independently verifiable methodology and sort of outlook into these algorithms, to start pushing in that direction. So if you look at the computer science research and on the internet privacy research, there's a field called multi-party computation or formal verification and a lot of things like that. I'm being a bit general, but anyway, there's...
Keep it simple for us.
No, I'm not even using the terms correctly. Okay. But if you look at what's going on in these fields, you'll find that we're going in a direction where we are, in fact, able to independently verify how a system works without necessarily having access to all of the internal aspects of that system.
All right, let's take a look at two reactions. First, that of Google. Google responding that every year it issues hundreds of improvements, it says, to its algorithms in its statement, adding that search is not used to set a political agenda and we don't bias our results towards any political ideology. A second reaction, and I'll put it to you, Rahim Kassam, that of Donald Trump's chief economic advisor. He is saying that the administration was, quote, taking a look at whether Google's search engine should be regulated by the government. Should algorithms be public? Should there be a regulation of algorithms?
Well, firstly, I just want to say that the first sort of 4 minutes of what we just heard make absolutely no sense, because on the one hand, we're being told that Google ranks things per clicks, and that's why political insecurities don't necessarily apply. And on the other hand, we just heard, well, nobody really knows how the algorithms work. So it's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. Let's understand which one it is. Right? At the moment in the United States, these social media companies and these big tech companies, they're actually granted provisions by the federal government that defend them against being treated as a publisher. There's Title 230 of the Communications Decency Act. There's Title 2 of net neutrality laws. There are all these things that actually are already regulating the industry, but regulating it in favor of those companies. You know, you as a broadcaster, a print media organization, you actually have more responsibility on your heads. Your editors have more responsibilities on their heads than Twitter and Facebook and Google do. And when you look at how news is generated nowadays, when you look at how quickly things can spread, the virality of news online, I would say that's imbalanced. So yes, there obviously has to be a look somehow into how the algorithms work, but also we have to get to the political issue here.
Yeah, because Aisling's point was that...
Let me just finish this point. Let me finish this point very quickly. In 2014, Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google back then, approached the Clinton campaign and asked to be their chief outside advisor. How can you have the arbiters of information around the world offering to put their finger on the scales for a political campaign?
Aisling Connolly was making the point that Google wants to make money you're suggesting that there's a conspiracy against Donald Trump?
Of course, every time we raise issues, we're the big conspiracy theorists. You throw around words like alt-right and conspiracy theory. Yeah, we're the nutcases. That's why so many people are now looking at this issue very seriously. That's why the FCC is going to be investigating this. The FTC is going to be investigating it. The Federal Elections Commission is going to be looking at whether or not these are in-kind donations to political campaigns when the likes of Facebook and Google actually do put their fingers on the scale. You introduced this segment by saying it comes in the same week that Facebook knocks 20 people, 20 accounts off in a certain election around the world. What you didn't say is that literally 2 days ago, the New York Times reported on how Facebook staff have admitted there is a mob mentality and a liberal intolerance. It's on the New York Times. This isn't Boulevard Voltaire or Breitbart or Russia Today or whatever. This is in a mainstream news organization. They've done a whole piece on it, and I encourage people to read it because it really gets to the nub of what's going on here.
So algorithms should be made public?
Well, algorithms are editors. They're just digital editors. They're like you have an editor and like I've had an editor in my past. They just happen to be coded by somebody to automate that editing process. It's not even so much that that the public needs to know how the algorithm works, but they have to be subject to scrutiny. And there should be new legislation in the United States that suggests that every person, every user, regardless of their political affiliation, no matter how dirty or disgusting your political views are, and there are plenty of people with horrible views out there, that they have protections under the First Amendment, under freedom of speech protection, that they're not just kicked off these platforms, which, by the way, are not private businesses. They're key state joint actors because they work hand in hand with governments. That cannot be seen to be happening anymore.
Gregory Smith-Simon, you agree?
Well, I'm fascinated by the idea of nationalizing Facebook, Google, and other social media platforms. I'm enough of a social democrat
They're
to think
already
it might
helped
be
by
an
the
interesting
governments.
thing to
They're
try.
already funded by governments.
As I said, I'd love to see it. I think that what's interesting is the way that we've struggled to understand the new media landscape, but in a lot of ways, many of the issues that we have faced for a long time are still here. So, you know, discussions about yellow journalism or, frankly, presidents' concerns that there's not enough good news out there are not new. I think that what we see that's a little bit different is that in the past it was human editors that were deciding which story was going to go on the front page at top of the fold, and now it's algorithms. We didn't know the secret sauce that went on in the New York Times editorial room to make those decisions, and we still don't. But what Google and Facebook add to it is, you know, people get their news from a network of a social network that makes sense to them. We now have the chance to see what the digital network looks like as well. I would add that, you know, while we see lots of things come across our phones and our screens, generally people only make sense of stories that fit with the understanding they have of the world. And so we see a story, but it's really when you talk to your friends, your family members, your coworkers, and hash it out, that story makes sense. So while I want to make sure that information is widely available, I think that we want to think about the way that people process this information, and that, you know, if you threw a story to someone that didn't match their political orientation, it wouldn't stick very long. So there's more to the story than just the algorithms. There's the discussion that's going on around it, and whether Facebook is, for instance, the best place for that discussion to happen.
And should there be a regulation of how the search engine works?
You know, I'm in the strange position of saying I'm a social democrat and being averse to regulation, and having conservatives who normally want to deregulate wanting to see these platforms more closely monitored and controlled by the government.
Why is that?
As an American steeped in the First Amendment, I'm concerned with the idea that the government would have anything to say. Frankly, Google could have a political bias and be open about it, and in the United States, there'd be nothing we could do about it. So the idea that there's political bias, I think, is legitimate. Frankly, there always is. So whether we should regulate it or not is a slippery slope.
Aislinn Connolly?
I agree, actually. I think you make some very nice points there. And I think regulation is something that we've seen come into play in Europe very recently, and there is more of it now that they're trying to make. And I think now with all of these algorithmic biases, there's one key component that's missing. We keep hearing about Donald Trump and the government says this, and that, you know, Google says this, and GAFA, Facebook, Twitter says that. And they like, do they
The
have...
GAFA refers to those four giants, right?
Yeah.
Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. I hope I put them in the right order.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the key component that we're missing from this is people. And like, I think a lot of these issues arise now from the fact that all people now, because of these platforms, have a voice that can be heard. And so we're all of a sudden hearing all of these kind of disparate opinions, and which gives rise to kind of, you know, maybe some hate speech or whatever. And so if you want to regulate these algorithms, which are just designed by a bunch of people in Silicon Valley, if you start to bring more people into this, more diversity, if you want to regulate it, then you need to bring the people into it as well. You need to bring regular citizens.
Concretely, what does that mean, bringing regular citizens in?
It just means that I feel the government and these big companies should not have full control anymore. So if you want to write legislation, it should come somehow by voting or with heavy feedback from citizens.
We saw that fine leveled against Google by the European Commission recently. It went into the billions and billions, and then we realized, well, it's a drop in the bucket now when you look at
these fines are meaningless. They're not. I wouldn't even qualify them as a political gesture. I would rather focus on what the people participating from the United States just said. So it's true that when the New York Times was dealing with the headlines without any algorithms, we would have some sort of magic chemistry with the editor deciding what was important. And now we have these algorithms deciding what's important. And so when...
so it's not left versus right, it's man versus machine?
No, hold on. So when Mr. Rahim Kassam says, you know, I don't trust these algorithms, nothing makes sense. You're saying that you don't know how these algorithms work, but you're saying that they're prioritizing clicks. So we don't know how they work entirely, sure, but we do, you know, we can extrapolate some very basic elements of how algorithms work. They are enticed by journalism that is relevant, that is getting attention, that is likely to get eyeballs. That we can extrapolate without being experts, okay? So, but the thing is, when someone like Mr. Kassam makes this argument that the algorithms have indeed replaced the editor, he's making it from a point of view where he's looking at these, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting his point of view, that he's looking at these companies like Facebook and Google as companies that have repeatedly been criticized for having a very isolated and intolerant political culture internally. So, for example, at Google, you had this diversity memo debacle, and recently a similar thing happened at Facebook. And I think, you know, without commenting on my personal opinion on these issues, I think that this is from where someone like Mr. Kassam is coming from, and this is exactly why we need, irrelevant of our partisanship or our political affiliations, to have these algorithms laid bare for us to examine,
to be made public.
Or if you know, you might face a lot of resistance for them to be made public, because of the trade secrets argument and so on. But what I'm trying to say as a computer scientist, that we might be able to identify how they work, get a certain level of certainty.
A bit more transparency.
And so if you're someone who doesn't trust Facebook or Google because of the sort of animosity you have towards their internal political culture, or if you're the complete opposite and you think what they're doing is great, all of us would be able to look at the science, look at the data.
It's important to shed light. I'm gonna have to interrupt you. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And we're wondering, do you regulate search engines? Do you regulate social media on the heels of remarks by the US president and other important events that have taken place, not just in the US, but around the globe this past week? We're talking about it with Aislinn Connolly, who's a researcher at France's prestigious École Normale Supérieure, a cryptographer, as is Nadim Kobesi. Welcome back to both of you. Welcome back as well to Rahim Kassam, with the Claremont Institute think tank, formerly with Breitbart, and Gregory Smith-Simon, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. His latest book, Cause and How It Doesn't Always Equal Effect. We talked about a little bit in part one of our discussion on Monday, just as the United Nations was leveling an accusation of genocide against leaders in Myanmar over last year's crackdown on Rohingya Muslims. Facebook announced it was banning 20 Burmese individuals or groups. They include Senior General Min Hong Leng, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and also banned the military's Miyawadi television network. Now, when the country opened up in 2013, Facebook became immensely popular there. It was a prime tool for propaganda during last year's crackdown that forced some 700,000 Rohingya to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. The UN Human Rights Commissioner chastising Facebook for coming on board a little bit late, only he says, when his lead person on Burma issued her conclusions.
When Yang Li, in her press conference, spoke about Facebook in Myanmar, their attitude began to change. But it shouldn't be because the press or the human rights community highlights the problem for them then suddenly to respond. They should be aware of it ahead of time. And they should be aware of it well before, thinking about the profit motive or how many users they have.
Gregory Smith-Simon, it's been a year and a half since the U.S. Elections, where there were accusations of Russia meddling. Next week, there's going to be more hearings on the role of social media in spreading hate or undermining messages. Your thoughts on Facebook and Myanmar?
Well, I think that quote was interesting. I would disagree. I don't want Facebook to be the entity that's taking the initiative. And an experience I had just this morning, I was at my publisher's office at Melville House, and the marketing person there said that they publish a lot of political books. They publish a lot of books about Trump. They can no longer post things about their books on Facebook. They just get rejected. And so they have to be very careful and quote reviews of their books that don't mention what the books are about. Otherwise, they can't get the word out. So I think that it may be appropriate to restrict the access of military leaders that are promoting genocide. But I don't know that it's Facebook who should decide whose message gets out and whose doesn't. And the fact that you would wait for indictments, government action, and official report might be appropriate. I think the fact that legitimate political outlets in the U.S. are having trouble expressing themselves on Facebook, which until then I think people had felt like was a forum for political discussion, is quite disturbing. And
here's the problem on that score. These are U.S.-based tech giants. Who decides over how to regulate in this instance? Is it the United States? Is it or is it the United Nations? Who's got jurisdiction when people use Facebook to stoke hate in Myanmar?
Exactly. And I think, the American perspective that the response to hate speech is more speech is an article of faith in the U.S., but that's also an empirical question, and it's one that European countries, among others, have answered differently, where there is much more legislation restricting what people can say on the belief that hate speech is actually dangerous. I think that's going to be one of the more complicated questions. You have countries and cultures that have very different beliefs about what it's appropriate to permit and what it is offensive to allow, even on a political level. And I don't think we've figured out how to adjudicate that yet.
Rahim Kassam, whose job is it to control when Facebook pages are being used to spread hate?
Well, look, I mean, every national government will have its mechanisms and as your previous guest said, their own sort of national philosophies surrounding the policing of speech and the, calls to violence and genocide. I think we can probably all agree take it too far, but that's not what President Trump has been talking about. And it's in that sort of filth, when we get that deep into the discussion, that we actually have to think of policy solutions. Somebody mentioned earlier in the discussion the idea that we didn't know the secret source of the New York Times editorial decision-making process. The distinction we have to understand is that the New York Times wasn't protected by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. They were liable to be sued. They were liable for further action taken against them, whether it's by an individual or class action or a corporate entity. Actually, actually what we have here in the United States, where I am currently, is a situation where the government is protecting these big tech giants with that legislation. And that probably has to be the first thing that's truly addressed here before we even get to answering the question as to who watches the watchers. Because right now, it's government that's watching the watchers. And I'm not sure that chimes in with what most people want to see around the world, is that it has to be a combination of think tank, NGO, civil society, and governmental organizations. And we're just not seeing that right now.
There's going to be, sadly, there's going to be other Myanmars in the future. What's the lesson you've learned from what happened a year ago when it comes to social media?
I think for me, what I learned through this process is that actually there are some really nice ideas floating around there. People, like organizations like the United Nations, have a very strong stance on what they believe to be human rights in general, but now take more and more efforts to make, resolutions on how they feel that governments should deal with digital rights. And so in the case of accounts on Facebook that may be leaning in a political direction that that's not necessarily, that Facebook might not like, the UN says, you cannot censor them. You should not be able to delete them. It should be, there should be, a very long and kind of transparent report on why anybody is being mistreated, let's say, or why anybody is treated differently. And so I think this is the main thing that I've learned, that there are people fighting very much for this kind of freedom of speech online.
Can it be done? Can hate speech be prevented online, Nadim Kalbesi?
I mean, if that report's going to be one hell of a long report, if it's going to ever be produced, and so that's why I would like to argue that I think that the existing frameworks we have at looking at this, whether they be nation-state frameworks or even socio-political frameworks, cultural frameworks, they might all be obsolete. I mean, by the time I have kids, and so I think that if you want a really good example of that problem, look at what happened with the lynchings in India. So a Facebook-owned company, WhatsApp, had a bunch of people messaging rumors to each other that such and such person did such and such crime, and so all of them were lynched. And India went and took a class action against Facebook. Facebook cannot do anything about this, because WhatsApp, unlike other Facebook services, is end-to-end encrypted. And so the information exchanged over WhatsApp cannot be viewed by Facebook, cannot be modified or intercepted by Facebook. Facebook cannot control or even understand which messages are the ones.
What do you do?
I think that, honestly, this is where...
What do you do to stop the lynching?
This is the part of the conversation. So Facebook has set up a research fund, just to be clear, in their defense. But this is the part of the conversation where I think that looking at these things from the frameworks that we have, class action, human rights bodies, governments, becomes completely impotent. And we start sort of wondering, are we living in a sci-fi universe now? Is this discussion reaching towards science fiction? Are we starting to reason in a situation where these entities like Facebook, YouTube, etc., have more power, influence, and control than nation states themselves? And just one final point. I mean, another guest made a point that I don't think really applies here, which is that Mr. Kassam said something about a class action, a certain provision protecting companies like Google, but not protecting New York Times. I would simply like to ask: has there been a class action that was shot down in the United States over such a protection? I don't really. Perhaps I'm ignorant, but I don't really think so. And even when we go further than that and start looking at things like the First Amendment.
I mean, there haven't been class actions, but there have been lawsuits which have been struck down as a result of Section 230. But actually, in 1997, the ACLU challenged Section 230, not under the auspices of what we're talking about today, but it was found to be unconstitutional. That's how far we've gone with this. So it's already been found by a court to be unconstitutional, but it's still on the books. That's all I'm getting at.
I just think that may be true. I just think that in general, when we're looking at what these companies have been capable of, I mean, if they all collaborate together to censor someone off the internet in a single hour, like we saw recently,
with that conspiracy theorist Alex Jones,
with Alex Jones. And so the thing with Alex Jones is that the argument was that he broke codes of conduct, which is a reasonable argument. He apparently did. And so had he been removed from these platforms, for example, one week saw him removed from Facebook, and the other week saw him removed from YouTube, and then the third week saw him removed from iTunes, I think I wouldn't have had any problem with that seeing that he broke their rules and everything. But what we saw was him being removed from Facebook, Apple, iTunes, Spotify within the same 1 hour, and then from YouTube again within the same 24 hours. And so we start looking at a situation where all of these enormous companies with unfathomable power, equaling nation states, in my opinion, kind of are able to take away every single Gutenberg printing press away from you in the same 1 hour. And so had they done it independently, it wouldn't have been as concerning to me. But the fact that it happened simultaneously like that seemed to indicate some kind of implicit or undeclared sudden political understanding.
Gregory Smith-Simon, you agree? Does it bother you as well?
It does bother me because fundamentally corporations are not publicly accountable, and so I don't think that they're the ones that should be making these decisions. I think that we want bodies that have some greater degree of public accountability rather than it being these corporations that do that. I'm concerned too. I think as you see the restrictions, it gives you a sense that some of these platforms are interested in sort of creating a context that is friendly and conducive to advertising, but avoids things that are prickly, difficult, and contentious. I understand that some things cross the line and are really dangerous, but I'm not sure that these corporations would make the same sorts of distinctions and draw the lines in the same place that the general public would, who wants to have an open debate.
I want to get back to what Nadeem was talking about a second ago, that spate of lynchings we've seen in India, like in June in Maharashtra state, after WhatsApp messages went viral accusing men of running a child abduction ring. People were murdered. Last week, WhatsApp CEO Chris Daniels traveled to India and got an earful from the Communications and Information Technology Minister.
You must have a grievance officer in India and a whole system of that to which people can reach immediately. He should be located in India. Second, you must have a proper compliance of Indian laws. We will not appreciate a scenario where any problem arisen will have to be answered in America only. No, not acceptable. And thirdly, WhatsApp, having become an important component of India's digital story, must have a proper corporate entity located in India.
Aizen Connolly, your thoughts on what you heard the minister there just say?
I think some of the points that he makes are very correct in the sense that, you know, it should not be up to Facebook or, you know, some American company or government.
A U.S. jurisdiction.
Exactly, to make the decision on this. But at the same time, I'm not sure what India can do about this at the moment, because I think that with apps like WhatsApp and messaging apps like this that are end-to-end encrypted, where, you know, you can... okay, the problem's not completely solved, but let's say you can talk in private where the government can't see what happened. I think this is a very good thing. And I think that these arguments of... Because
we've had that debate here, for instance, about Telegram.
Yeah, exactly.
And the fact that jihadis were using it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a non-argument that was used by, you know, the American government in the 70s. We've moved past this. We've moved past the fact that, like, you know, they should be able to see everything. So I think... But
if it's a matter of public security, what do you do in the case of WhatsApp, in the case of Telegram?
I mean, if it's a matter of public security, what do you do if it's if there's some guys meeting in a room in the local hall? You know, it's the same thing. They can have a conversation there without you hearing them, or like just on the street. So
this is something that we've defended many times, and I completely agree with that. I think that it's true that you can make the same argument. What if someone, instead of spreading rumors on WhatsApp, simply spreads rumors in the hallway of their workplace? I think that one thing that WhatsApp is able to do...
WhatsApp is much more viral than having a conversation
one emergent
in the hall.
effect. One emergent effect of giving everyone end-to-end encryption, etc., isn't that the encryption is causing the problem. It's simply the fact that WhatsApp allows you to spread rumors like a veritable... You know,
so what do you do? You shut it down? Do you shut down WhatsApp? What do you do?
No, I don't. I love WhatsApp. I don't think communication services that
even when libel is being spread and hate.
I think,
Francois, if I
sure, yeah.
If I may, I think that we should have a discussion about whether we want the government to be able to control these entities or whether we should be able to intercept the messages. But it's not helpful to pretend that we can't, which is to say, what happens when people gather in a room is that the government wiretaps phones. They use infiltrators in organizations. They get court orders to allow them to listen. They do a lot of things to intercept communication that they think is dangerous. And in the 20th century, there was a legal framework that allowed them to do it sometimes and prohibited them to do it without probable cause. You could have the same requirements. So I'm not saying that you should, but I don't think that we should throw our hands up. When we say that these communication companies are more powerful than governments, that's not true. Facebook doesn't have an aircraft carrier and Google doesn't have a judicial system or a prison.
Yeah, that's
so
not
let's
the only
remember
form
who's
of
got the
power.
real power. No, but what I mean is that we should talk about whether we want to regulate it or under what circumstances a government should or should not restrict it, not pretend that it's not possible to do it,
I just like
we've
to make
seen
a quick
that has
point.
changed.
I'd just like to make a quick point. So as a cryptography engineer, when all of us were advocating for end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp, the threat model that many of us had in mind was the protection against despotic governments. If you had some kind of dictator government looking at your messages, you don't want that. And that was the threat model that I would admit someone like me looked at this problem with and felt justified implementing the systems. These systems being used to send messages, libel, and worse than libel, rumors that lead to people being lynched for horrendous crimes en masse by civilians that are being innocently misled is something that I don't have an answer to, and I think is a legitimate problem. I don't think anyone in this space has an answer to it.
Rahim Kassam?
I have an answer to it. Look, let's not pretend for the start that these end-to-end encryption apps are fully secure. They're not fully secure. So if somebody does really want to see what you're saying, they still can do, especially with sort of mass market ones like WhatsApp. I appreciate there are some more secure ones. Number two, government shouldn't be in the business of trying to read your messages, like it's not in the business or shouldn't be in the business of trying to read your mail or your post. It seems to me that this is a law and order problem, and it seems that unless the governments are willing, whether they're the regional or national governments,
but it's all happening faster than before.
Are willing. Yes, fine. But what have we done in the past when people abuse sort of mass communications techniques? You punish them to the fullest extent of the law, and it creates a deterrent for those people. As I understand it, India isn't going the full hog in the way of actually punishing these people, and they're deferring the blame to organizations like WhatsApp. Now, look, as I've said over the course of this debate, I am one of the biggest critics of these big social media and tech companies, but I do not want government being able to read things that ordinary people say. So this is a law and order solution that needs to be found to this. And frankly, since I'm the right-winger on the panel, I'll say this: the death penalty.
All right.
Oh, wow.
Well, that opens another debate. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that one, but I want to thank you so much, Rahim Kassam, for joining us from Washington, Gregory Smith-Simon in New York, Aisling Connolly, and Nadine Kobesi. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
Debate because we had a lot of diversity of opinion. I appreciate that. It's usually not
A rousing endorsement from Nadine. Let's say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
The debate is also happening in the media, traditional and other.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of people are wondering why exactly Donald Trump has chosen this particular moment to launch his attack on the issue of algorithms and Google in particular. Some people have this as a very clear idea of what's going on. Vice News reporting on this, saying Trump starts a feud with an algorithm after Googling his own name. And a lot of people felt, because these tweets came before dawn, we're talking 5 o'clock in the morning, he got up to rant about the fact that he felt there was discrimination on Google news searches. And they felt that that was the case as well. However, there is perhaps a more sensible option than the President of the United States sitting there Googling himself at 5 a.m. This appears to have been the inspiration for it all. PJ Media wrote this article. It came out on the 25th of August. The headline reads, 96% of Google search results for Trump news are from liberal media outlets. Now, Trump never cited any particular source for his claims, but he did use that figure of 96%, which does seem to make it more obvious that this
What is PJ Media?
PJ Media, well, exactly. It is a very good question. It's a conservative website, unsurprisingly, given what they're saying. Media Bias Fact Check has taken a look at them. They put them pretty far over onto the right wing there, not quite labelled extreme. What they say is that this is actually quite a popular site. We're talking sort of 13 million page views per month, and that although it's basically, it was launched back in 2004. The idea was it was a challenge to the mainstream media with a network of citizen journalists. We've heard all this kind of thing before. Now, they actually rate them as borderline questionable, even though they cite a number of articles that were proven to be false, but they haven't quite reached the threshold of being deemed completely untrustworthy. Just to give you an idea of some of the articles that have been fact-checked, including this one by Snopes, PJ Media had claimed that liberals at the University of Texas wanted to designate masculinity a mental illness.
Or they're putting the question.
Well, yes, but the article on PJ Media is slightly more, well, less forgiving,
in the affirmative
shall we say.
tense.
Absolutely. But Snopes say, no, this isn't the case, and that things were being grossly misrepresented, including by PJ Media. So looking elsewhere at what's being said on this one, well, Wired reporting that Google obviously have said that they have no political bias in their search engine.
Excellent.
However, they do say that it is the perfect target for Donald Trump. And the reason is this, because his claims can't be easily fact-checked and so or dismissed by anyone. And so the charges of bias against Google will stick with those who want to listen to it because no algorithm is truly neutral. And of course, it comes in the wake of various accounts, including Alex Jones, the most famous conspiracy right-wing conspiracy theorist, and his InfoWars site. They've had all sorts of controls and restrictions placed on them by social media websites in recent weeks. Alex Jones himself saying that he's been advising Trump on this issue. We don't know whether that's true, but that's what he has claimed. This came from the Washington Post technological correspondent, Jeffrey Fowler, and he points out that although you may have questions about Trump's attacks on Google, saying that perhaps they're not grounded in solid research, there are also questions to be asked about Google itself because they're not particularly open about what exactly happens with these algorithms. And also the fact that they're basically not beyond reproach because look what happened when they tried to censor things in China.
Next week, there's going to be the those hearings that are taking place at the U.S. Capitol on the Russia meddling in the U.S. elections. The CEO of Google is not going. He's sending one of his underlings. Your thoughts on that?
I think it's maybe a wise move that he does this because then he can dismiss whatever the underling says. I mean, I don't think this is going to be a happy TV show, let's say. It's not going to come up on the good news pile. But
no, indeed. And a lot of people feel that basically Donald Trump is getting a reality check when he does a Google News search, if indeed he ever does do that. Some reporting that he doesn't actually ever use a computer himself, which is an interesting one. So it must all just be done on his telephone. But the Washington Post is looking at this issue, saying that there are lots of things that go into how highly something ranks in a news search. So why something's placed above something else. It can be how recent the article is, whether it's original reporting rather than just collating information from other places, how much traffic goes to those sites. So the bigger the site, the more the traffic, the more prominence it's going to have. So CNN versus something like, well, the Drudge Report, for example, the comparison is going to be very, very different in terms of the numbers seeing those sites. The other thing that affects these searches is what you have searched for before.
Right.
So this PJ Media reporter, it's quite conceivable that she's actually been looking at CNN's website a lot herself and maybe has found that, oh yes, CNN's coming up very high, and maybe that is actually skewing what the PJ Media report was all about.
And apparently as well, geographical location?
Yeah.
From where you're...
Yeah. Absolutely. And a lot of people claiming as well that Fox News is often coming up quite low because it doesn't have an SSL certificate, which basically means it doesn't have as much security as it should have. And if it had more security on its site, then it would actually rate higher on Google. So that's another interesting aspect. The other thing as well is there is a certain irony in all this because as Donald Trump rails against what he sees as political censorship, he has actually failed to abide by a court order that said he had to unblock people on Twitter. He uses it as part of his presidential means of communication. The courts told him back in May or June this year that he had to unblock people because constitutionally they were allowed to see the statements he made. Now, they actually went to court again yesterday, telling the judge he hasn't done it yet. He's unblocked 20 more, but there are still some who can't get access to the president's tweets.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.